This is Undercurrents from Unheard, a twice-weekly news show covering the news and the ideas that matter beneath the surface. If you want to help build the show, you can go over and subscribe on our personal YouTube channel at Undercurrents, or go to undercurrents.tv for the full experience. Your first month will only be $1, and subscribers get access to a huge range of behind-the-scenes content and paywall bonus episodes too. This is big, and it's only the beginning. We've got a big show today. We're going to check in with James in the Unheard Newsroom and talk about Donald Trump's wild interview at the National Association of Black Journalists Conference, and do a little bit of a maybe heterodox take on what the media is saying and where both James and I think that goes wrong. Pretty interesting issue. James is also going to help us dig into what's happening in Southport all the way to Westminster actually this week. A pretty fascinating case study and a horrific tragedy out of the UK that is making waves and is going to prove to be hugely consequential. There's just no question about it. So we're going to dive into that with James. I have an interview with Kevin Roberts, who's the head of the Heritage Foundation and the head of Project 2025, which found itself in the midst of basically a battle with the Trump campaign yet again this week. It may prove to be the final battle between Project 2025 and the Trump campaign, because Project 2025 seems like it's kind of moving on and heading to a lower profile. But I had the opportunity to talk to Kevin Roberts about Project 2025. So I'm going to play a little bit of that interview, and we're going to talk about what I think Democrats are getting really correct about Project 2025 and their attacks, and then where everything else is being wildly misunderstood into this myth-building exercise that honestly I think has been counterproductive. And I'll explain why on today's show. Then we have Sey and Michele Tafoya, both people who have incredibly deep insight into what happens at the highest echelons of sports and sports coverage. They're here to talk about everything we've seen from the Olympics just over the course of the last week. It's a fascinating interview, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with everybody, so stay tuned. We're starting, as usual, with our first segment with Unheard Newsroom editor James Billow. James, huge news day here in Washington, D.C. I had CNN on yesterday as Donald Trump sat down at the National Association of Black Journalists on the stage and just immediately, right out of the gate, laid into them. To be fair, they started off with the first question laying into him and just went back and forth. Donald Trump was seemingly very upset that they had been late and that their equipment wasn't working well, which Harris Faulkner, who was on stage, Fox News host, seemed to agree with. She said she couldn't really hear the questions either, but it was a mess. And since, it's been all over the media. It was like leading political playbook this morning. Everybody is talking about how wild the interview was.
So yes, we will get into the reaction to that Trump visit shortly. I mean, it's been all over social media with lots of clips flowing around, so I just want to break those down for you. But just for a bit of context, so Donald Trump was in town. He was in Chicago, and he was there to speak to the National Association for Black Journalists. Now, this is a bit of a niche meeting, I have to say it.
Well, he claimed that they told him Kamala Harris would be there as well, or Joe Biden. He said, when we set this up, we agreed that my opponent would be here.
He was in a pretty cantankerous mood, but by the sounds of it, it was pretty well justified. So as you mentioned, there were tech issues. The presenters were 35 minutes late for whatever reason. He was promised that Kamala would be there, but then they said she's actually going to be on Zoom, and then she didn't even appear on Zoom. So it got off to a bad start, but it was the first presenter who really went in studs up. And I got to show you the first 15 seconds of this clip where he's essentially asked about whether Kamala is a DEI hire.
I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much. And she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black.
So they were clearly going for a bit of a gotcha, playing his own words back to him, and in classic Trumpian form, he basically dodged it a bit. He said, I don't know, it raises a lot of questions. It was interesting to see what he said about the fact that she essentially changed ethnicity or changed race a few years ago to dial up her blackness. Now, this got a lot of pickup, and from the progressive left in particular, they're like, well, this is borderline racist, what's going on here? And it was very interesting to see that a few pieces actually had come out just the week before, and we have this New York Times header here, where essentially they talk about her Indian American heritage too, and how under-discussed that has been on the campaign trail. So I don't know what you make of that, Emily.
Yeah, I think there's something to that because there are old clips of her emphasizing her Indian American heritage. It is going to be a weird, I think it fits into the Trump campaign's narrative. They think it fits into this narrative of her as being kind of phony, someone who blows wherever direction the wind takes her. And that's why Trump in his mind is latching onto these attacks, that she's always been fake. You don't know which version of Kamala Harris you're gonna get, and whether it's immigration, whatever flip-flops she's made, it's all part of the same theme of her career, which is she'll just blow in whichever direction that the wind is taking her. So I understand why that's in his head. There are strategists giving quotes to every mainstream media outlet here in DC and up in New York by you, James, Republican strategists freaking out about this. There have been congressmen and senators saying on the record they don't think this is the right direction for Donald Trump to go in. It's identity politics. Josh Hawley invoked that. He said, I don't think there should be identity politics in either direction when he was asked about it. But it seems to be the consensus among Republicans even that Trump went in a dangerous direction and an unhelpful direction yesterday.
Right, and there have been a lot of clips basically proving that, but it was also classic Trump in a lot of other respects. He was clearly playing with the crowd, and I think there has been a bit of misinterpretation because of these clips, just slicing and dicing 10, 15 seconds here, 10 seconds there. And actually, the crowd response was quite interesting. I watched this talk twice, and you can see a lot of disapproval at what Trump's saying, particularly when he said that Harris had failed the bar exam. But there are a lot of other times where they actually seemed to warm to him quite a bit, and he got a lot of applause. And when he was really dialing on consumer prices, the threat of immigration to black jobs, he defined black jobs as jobs for anyone, there seemed to be a slightly warmer response to the president, which, given where he was playing or speaking, it was quite an interesting reaction. So we had the classic lines like, I've been the best president for black people since Abraham Lincoln. He was upset about Biden dropping out. But this narrative that it was a train wreck interview, I don't think that paints the whole picture.
No, I was going to say the same thing. And I'm glad you said it, because I was going to say that I have a very unpopular take on this, which is CNN immediately pivoted to hysteria. Immediately pivoted to total hysteria. They were interviewing members of the National Association of Black Journalists about what a disaster it was. They were, and I'm not making this up, litigating how many people failed the bar exam in California in the aftermath of the speech. And you saw the same thing across the rest of the media. And it reminded me so much of every time Donald Trump in 2015, 16, 17, when he first was in the White House, when he was first running for office. It was such a flashback to the media not knowing what to do with Donald Trump, and to act like every time he is Donald Trump. He is, you love him or hate him, this is who he has been. It's who he's been for years, and he's the same guy no matter what. So to cover him as though this is going to be, a campaign disaster, when we've discovered time and again that his voters don't really mind it. His voters are willing to overlook it because they, have different priorities than a lot of people in elite media. There's just none of that driving the conversation yesterday, driving the conversation today, which is still reacting to yesterday. It's just so counterproductive. Actually, speaking of CNN, James, another thing we wanted to talk about is the news yesterday that CNN is shutting down the opinion section of its website, which it seems like it would be a pretty decent source of traffic. Their website is much, much, much more popular than their cable side. Their cable side is putting them in financial difficulty, to say the least, because the ratings have gone down so significantly. What did you make of this?
Obviously, any network isn't particularly promotional about the fact that it is nixing or axing one of its sections. And it was a very muted announcement. Essentially, an opinion editor wrote in an email saying, just a quick note to let you know that unfortunately, CNN has decided to shut down the opinion section. I hope our paths cross elsewhere. So the whole opinion section has now been kiboshed. It's off the site, or it's about to be. And this comes, as you mentioned, at a time where it's hitting 10-year lows in viewership. It's facing layoffs. It's facing cost cutting. But the interesting thing here is just exactly how the right and left reacted. So the left didn't take too much notice of it, but the right, they seem to think that, well, CNN coverage is so infused with opinion anyway that this is actually just basically confirming what already exists, that we don't need an opinion section when our broadcast coverage is already doing that.
You know, the difference though, I will give CNN this. I think the difference between their broadcast version of CNN, the brand, is so different than what's on their website, whether they have an opinion section or not. There are like really good reporters at CNN who are still doing like the actual Lord's work in war zones, just doing good reporting, traditional journalism. And a lot of that goes up on the site, and it's more branded with that typical CNN kind of. Clarissa Ward is a good example of one person that they have left on the broadcast side who does that kind of journalism. So they're in the middle of an identity crisis, and if they want to just come out and admit that they're fully left of center, I think that's what every outlet that actually is left of center should do, and that would go a huge way towards restoring trust in media. But that's just not going to happen unless they suddenly realize they can make a bunch of money by doing that, which I don't know, maybe they could, but this is why I, James, am not a CEO of a media conglomerate, because that would be a disaster.
Given the amount of churn that's going on at the organization, you could be getting a job pretty soon, so hold tight.
The other thing probably worth mentioning is Nora O'Donnell announced that she was leaving the CBS Evening News anchor slot. That's basically like the Walter Cronkite, when a lot of people think of those old trusted newsmen. It looks like CBS, by some reports, might be going to a rotating anchor situation for their nightly news, which is a very, very easy but important change to overlook. Nightly news used to be where Americans sat down and consumed their dose of news media and felt like they were in touch with the world and understood the country and were informed. And the fact that that has gone away technologically is not surprising at all, but it's a real landmark, I think, in American culture. And Nora O'Donnell is probably one of the few people who could pull off that evening news anchor slot in the way that she did. So very interesting development there. James, I'm really sad about this mental health study that you're about to highlight as it relates to adolescence. Just not surprising again, but incredibly depressing.
Yes, well, this is another really quite grim confirmation of the youth mental health crisis that is occurring in not just America, but across the West. What this study found by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration is that nearly 1 in 3 adolescents, that's 1 in 3, received mental health treatment last year. So in America, ages 12 to 17, that's 8.3 million. And commensurate with that, there are higher levels of prescriptions, higher levels of psychiatric visits. But what was interesting about this study, at least as far as I could see, was the framing around it. Now, SAMHSA, which is the abbreviation for the administration I just mentioned, they actually saw this increase as a positive development because they see it as an effort to normalize and destigmatize seeking mental health treatment. But it seems pretty concerning that millions and millions of young Americans are now seeking treatment, and I don't quite understand why they seem so positive about that.
The research that Jonathan Haidt has been doing basically finds patterns similar to this across the Western world as cell phones proliferated around the point of 2012, and those cell phones were loaded with social media and obviously with like access to internet porn. So there was just a big sweeping change, James, probably when you and I were like going into our late teens, early 20s. But really, this is significant. It's showing up everywhere. And something Abigail Schreier is really smart to note, and Haidt has noted this as well, that it's also coincided with trips to hospitals, emergency rooms for suicidal ideation or attempts in certain studies. And that's where it becomes clearer that it's not just access to therapy. It's not just the stigma of seeking help that's going away. There's something else. Those numbers in particular, I think, really underscore what we see in surveys like this one.
Yeah, and just a final point on that. Elsewhere in the report, they find that cigarette and alcohol use is down, which on the face of it, that seems like two healthy metrics on the down. But vaping is on the rise and weed or cannabis use is on the rise. Now, what is the difference between cigarette and alcohol use and vaping and weed? Well, cigarettes and alcohol in particular are very much social activities. Weed is more of a private activity or something you do in your own home. And it just seems reflective of this sort of atomization that's going on with adolescence that seems to be downstream of the COVID pandemic and lockdown from that.
Right, like you don't need to ask somebody for a light when you're vaping, either literal water vapor or water vapor with weed in it. You can just plug in USB-C. Now, James, yeah, I think that's a really important point too. And we see lower rates actually of another good example, sexual activity among teenagers too. So that's a social activity, as you mentioned as well, obviously. So it's clear that's why, Haidt himself went from the coddling of the American mind to, that's the results of that are antisocial behavior, which is what he's written about in his new book. James, this situation that is unfolding in the UK, Southport in particular, consequential, huge news in the UK, obviously, huge news in Europe. What's going on?
It does seem to slowly be filtering through into the US media, but just to give you the fundamentals before we dig into it a little bit more. Southport is a city in the northwest of England, just north of Liverpool and Manchester. And a few days ago, 3 girls were stabbed to death at a dance class. Now, this led to a huge reaction because misinformation started flying about on social media, and it was assumed or claimed that the man in question was an asylum seeker and he was Muslim. This was a man who was the child of Rwandan immigrants, which is a 99% Christian country. So not only was he not an asylum seeker, it's likely that he was not Muslim either. So 2 big pieces of information. But what then happened, this took off and protesters started throwing bricks at the local mosque. They started attacking police, and protests spread to other parts of the country. Places like Hartlepool, hundreds gathered in Westminster itself to protest what had happened. So very ugly scenes at the moment.
And where do you see this going, especially as the information is turning out to be different? I mean, that's a fascinating element of this, that people reacted to information that is turning out. We've seen this happen in the US, actually, kind of in the opposite ideological direction with a lot of police shootings, for example, where the details look, horrific and really bad, and then you get the video from another angle, or you get a longer version of the video, or you get more context from witnesses, and the story turns out to be different, and it doesn't seem to have a huge effect on the cultural reaction overall, and the way that we think of it, historically. So think of, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown is probably the best example in Ferguson, Missouri. Where do you see this going then ahead?
What initially happened was there was a story that this man was an Islamic asylum seeker, and it was picked up by the likes of Andrew Tate, Tommy Robinson, who is the former leader of the English Defence League, which is a far-right organisation in the UK, and also Nigel Farage. Now, a lot of people have been blaming X for this and Elon Musk for failing to censor this material, but what it really comes down to, and to throw the question forward, this could be a watershed moment for the police as well, because the police's failure to disclose key information until days after really allowed these rumors to take flight on social media. So where does it go from here? Hopefully, the police will start to get in gear a little bit more and start to respond to the public's needs and desire for information and release that information earlier. Otherwise, we're just going to see this kind of thing keep happening.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's if there were no social media, if hypothetically we could wave a wand and get rid of social media but still be in the year 2024, if the police aren't releasing information, people are still going to be speculating wildly on bar stools, at pubs, and at church, and at neighborhood gatherings. There's still, the disinformation is just people speculating. The difference with social media is that you publish it. You publish these kind of instantaneous thoughts and speculation because it's social media. You have to click publish to write that thought down and get it out into the world. That's how you kind of communicate with others. But you would be doing the same thing on a bar stool because that's how we are as human beings. So it's weird from my perspective to say that this means social media should be censored. Your problem is really with people. And the people's problem was not getting any information from other people, in this case, the police. All right, James Billow, thank you so much for this journey from Donald Trump's wild interview, which in and of itself was a journey, all the way to news from the UK. Appreciate it, James.
Thanks.
The true story of Project 2025 is a lot more interesting and complicated than the media narrative. And the media narrative has been strong and sustained for weeks now. Random people who don't really follow politics closely have asked me about Project 2025, which is somewhat amusing because, like a lot of people here in DC, I've actually had the full 900-page book for a year. The Heritage Foundation was giving them away, and still is. If you actually want to hear a ridiculous personal story about my interaction with J.D. Vance, Project 2025, and the Kamala Harris campaign, I will share what happened this week, crazy story for premium subscribers over on undercurrents.tv. Yesterday, Trump's simmering feud with Heritage came to a head as Kevin Roberts, who we'll actually hear more from in an interview in a moment, announced the project would end as planned after convention season, but that the personnel efforts would continue. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. The Trump team put out a statement basically taking a victory lap, dancing on the Project 2025 grave. Trump, hardly a creature of the conservative movement, feels no particular loyalty to its many foot soldiers, even as those people have, in some cases, risked their careers and their reputations to support him. To be fair, many others haven't, and his beef with the conservative movement has some pretty legitimate origins. But Trump, in this case, is pretty correct that the sustained blitz of attacks against him were working. Project 2025 sounded shady and mysterious, and I really think Democrats pretty brilliantly realized the political potential that it had. Since the 1980s, though, the Heritage Foundation has released a, quote, mandate for leadership document with policy proposals for incoming presidential administrations. Heritage is the most powerful conservative think tank in the country. So those proposals have carried weight with Republican administrations whose key personnel have always rotated from government world to the think tank world and vice versa. And that is very common on the left and the right here in DC. This time around, though, Heritage launched the 2025 Presidential Transition Project, as they called it, which combined the mandate for leadership with an effort to preemptively vet personnel in collaboration with tons of other conservative groups for the next presidential administration. So the goal was to have a clear and specific ideological direction, policy blueprint, and also a stable of people who could enact it. Republicans during Trump's administration realized career workers at cabinet agencies could block and slow walk policy demands from the president that they didn't like. They felt the GOP was wildly unprepared to actually offer policy ideas as well. So the goal was to have these basically ready to go when Trump or DeSantis or whomever took office. Under the leadership of Kevin Roberts, currently the president, Heritage has said it will not take any more funding from the defense industry or big tech. And on the right, that has been a breath of fresh air. Obviously, though, a wish list of conservative priorities will be popular with conservatives and, in a general election, unpopular with many non-conservatives, especially with a gigantic assist to Democrats from the media, which has basically taken their legitimately brilliant talking points and helped construct this huge myth around the project. So two things are true here. One, the media is being kind of dishonest, and two, Heritage is further right than most of the country. So I was able to interview Roberts one-on-one for this show about Project 2025 back at the RNC. Here's what he had to say.
The Biden campaign and Media Matters, I think, initiated all of this, and there will be some more offensive coming from us. But this is the point. Whatever someone has heard about Project 2025, if they've not gone to the website, project2025.org, and actually read it, you can assume that it's false, with one exception. The one thing Media Matters and the Biden campaign get right is that we do want to eliminate the Department of Education. Which is awesome. President Trump has said that explicitly as well. So if I were to make a prediction, whether it's a full elimination of the department or at least a massive reform, which needs to happen on behalf of kids, I think we can expect that to happen. So I'll give them partial credit for that.
Since you bring up labels, what do you think it is about Project 2025? Is it the name? Like, what is it that has made this document, this policy document, intriguing as like a narrative that the media's latched onto?
It's not the name, it's the fact that the policies are, for the most part, policies that Americans agree with wildly. But even more than that, it's that they have never confronted, the progressive Democrats have never confronted such a unified conservative movement. And it's unified not just in those policies, but also in terms of the people who, whether they serve in the Trump-Vance administration, which is up to the president, vice president, or whether they serve in a capacity at the state level, what they're saying is, we, common sense Americans, want to be part of restoring the American dream. And you know, progressive Democrats don't want the American dream to be alive. I think that's what they hate about Project 2025.
It's true, these types of proposals are extraordinarily common in politics. On its website, seeking to debunk myths about Project 2025, Heritage cites what the left-wing Center for American Progress did before the Obama administration. This is literally how think tanks operate, and the big ones always have close ties to the major political parties. It is not shady or weird relative to the standards of Washington, D.C. It's bipartisan and perfectly normal. Republicans seem merely not to have tried building a similar political attack tying, for instance, Obama to the CAP plan. So Democrats pulled off something pretty smart here. Personally, I have a lot of friends at Heritage and I'm pretty supportive of Roberts, so there's no way I can be entirely detached here. He has an ideological direction I think is healthy and matches my own pretty well. But to be clear, that's never stopped me from criticizing Heritage when they were taking money from the tech and the defense industries. And this time, honestly, the left got them, even though Heritage didn't do anything wrong. They're conservatives who believe conservative ideas about the border and immigration and climate change and social issues. So of course, they want a presidential administration to have policies that favor those ideas, and then they want that administration to have the ability to achieve them. What's most fascinating to me about Project 2025 is that under Roberts, Heritage really started pushing the traditional boundaries of conservative orthodoxy on issues like trade and the intelligence agencies. In the mandate for leadership itself, Heritage commissioned arguments from new right positions and old right positions and kind of pitted them against each other, had them argue it out. That's in the project and in the book. The sad consequence of Project 2025 might just be that conservatives feel less and less inclined to find consensus with the left, because no matter what they say that's critical of the right, the media will usually tell the story most politically advantageous to Democrats. By the way, Heritage was calling on the Reagan administration to abolish the Department of Education back in the 1980s. That's in this edition of the Mandate for Leadership, and the media is acting like this is some brand new, secret, shadowy plan. So a lot of people are just going to think if we couple this old position from the 1980s that has been totally consistent with, for example, different ideas on trade, why should we even try? We're going to be misrepresented no matter what. So as we're all groping for ways to bring the temperature down, the glass half full take on Project 2025 is that conservatives are seriously considering taking traditionally left-wing stances on issues they never ever would have before. And now they're toxic to potential partners across the aisle if, they have any affiliation with Project 2025. So while it's been an absolutely shrewd and brilliant strategy for Democrats, for the country, it might be a bit of a nudge back in the wrong direction. It was absolutely my pleasure earlier this week to talk to Jennifer Sey and Michele Tafoya. Jennifer is the author of Levi's Unbuttoned. A lot of people know her because she was pushed out of Levi's during COVID over all kinds of different controversies. Absolutely ridiculous situation. She's now the head of a brand called XXXY Athletics. They have a new scholarship fund out. Michele Tafoya, legendary broadcaster here in the US. We love Michele Tafoya. They talked about kind of an inside the industry perspective on what was going on with the Olympics and how the Olympics were handling biological, men and women's sports, all of these really fraught, complicated, difficult questions on the Olympic stage, at least. Also a little bit about that crazy opening ceremony. Maybe crazy is my editorial position on it, but we asked them about that a little bit as well, what it's like at some of these corporate headquarters where both of them have spent a lot of time. The interview was taped. It turned out to be so prescient. It was taped before we saw the Algerian boxer and the Italian boxer in women's Olympic boxing competition get into this match that went massively viral because the Italian female boxer basically just walked to her corner after 46 seconds because she said the other boxer's punch just was too hard. Now, this other boxer, the Algerian boxer, failed gender tests. The way the Olympic determines testosterone levels, and the Olympics determine that. So there's this swirling controversy about why the Italian boxer was forced to compete against somebody who's failing gender tests, which gender tests seems like such a ridiculous thing that we even have to do to get into the Olympics in the first place. So everything that Jen and Michele says turns out to be really prescient. Jen competed as a gymnast for a long time at really, really high levels. And so she's able to talk about what she's hearing from current athletes that are competing even at the Olympics level, she mentions at one point in the interview. And everything they said, which was taped shortly before this boxing dust-up went massively viral, turned out to be prescient. So I hope you enjoy the interview. I learned a lot from it. They're two really fascinating people, neither of whom is really far on the right. Jen gets lumped into that category. Michele Tafoya gets lumped into that category. Jen's on the left. I think Michele describes herself as more libertarian, but neither of them is like a religious right, Christian conservative, along those veins. And yet they come to this table and find themselves in agreement with the right on this issue in a lot of ways. And we've seen that play out in different countries and different controversies around the world over the last decade. So I learned a lot from them. It's a fascinating interview. Check it out. All right, we're so excited to be joined today by both Jennifer Sey, CEO of XXXY Athletics, and Michele Tafoya of the Michele Tafoya podcast. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for having us.
So, Michele, you are a legendary broadcaster, and you have worked in these kind of elite spaces for a long time. In fact, you've covered the Olympics, and we're watching the Olympics go down right now in the middle of people really starting to question how important that biological divide between men and women is. We've seen this come up at a couple of Olympics so far. And then a lot of people saw the drag Last Supper at the opening ceremony and just maybe rethought everything they thought about how sports could be going in a better direction, although the Olympics apologized for it. So what do you make of how this issue has played out on the Olympic stage so far?
I remember when I was preparing for my first coverage, my preparation for a swim, because I did a ton of the swim in Rio and then again in Tokyo. And one of our assistants was doing research, and there was an athlete, biological female, which I shouldn't have to say that, but a female who wanted to go by different pronouns. And she was going through all the pronouns with us, and I said, this is baloney. She's competing as a woman. We're going to call her she because that's what the English language tells us to do. And that's what she is. And we sort of ditched that. Now, that was like 8-10 years ago. That was the first time I kind of thought, wow, this is something. Now cut to the opening ceremony of the Olympics, which made a lot of people angry because it was less about the celebration of the athletes and more about the celebration of identities. And that's where we've gone. That's where we're headed. And there's no one better to spearhead this movement of courage than Jennifer Sey. Seeing this go on at the Olympics, seeing the backlash was a little bit encouraging. It's kind of like the Bud Light backlash, right? The Olympics are trying to dictate the way that you speak about these athletes, the descriptive words like staying away from gender, staying away from what they are. And it's just strange, and it's unnecessary, and it's divisive.
I would imagine also demoralizing. Jen, I want to ask you about that because you are a champion gymnast and you understand the sport, you understand competing at high levels. And so I want to ask maybe, the XXXY Athletic Fund, I imagine, is partially to counter that serious problem of female athletes being demoralized. But could you speak to how much of a problem that's been maybe even for women in sports that aren't struggling with the kind of biological sex, trans question, non-political people, athletes just getting caught up in this culture war over and over again? What has that done?
I mean, we have completely abandoned material reality. That's why I think this issue is so important. It's so much more than protecting women's sports. It's about defending the truth. Michele just alluded to it earlier, but the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, issued media guidelines, which include sort of word usage, that kind of thing. And they've said you cannot use the phrases biological female or biological male when referring to trans athletes. And my understanding is there are 2 trans athletes competing in women's boxing, which is probably the worst place this could show up. It's a combat sport. But that said, they've issued these guidelines saying you cannot use these very truthful terms. And I agree with Michele, you shouldn't even need the word biological in front of either because they are just male or female. And it just, to me, is just, it's saying reality is offensive. I mean, what kind of world do we live in when we're told that reality, material reality, is going to hurt someone's feelings and is therefore offensive, and we cannot say what is true? You know, my feeling on the matter is that I will not call trans women biological males. I'll just call them males. There, I've taken the offense right out of it. But, you know, I think what you're asking, Emily, is, you know, how are the athletes to deal with this? And that's what we're trying to push back on and combat on and provide support to these athletes, because so many, I know, agree with us that women's sports must be protected. They work so hard and for so long, and they can accept any loss. Any of us can as athletes, as long as it's on an even playing field. But to be told that you must accept a loss that is utterly unfair because it is at the hands of a male athlete, and you have to stand there and take it and smile to be nice, I mean, it's unacceptable to me. So we want these young women, these female athletes who are currently competing, to know that when they stand up, they will not stand alone.
Emily, if I could just interject too, my husband was a college athlete. We have a daughter, we have a son, and he watches this with incredulity, sort of just like, what? And then he says, look, the women have to stand up. We can't do this all for them. The women have to do this for themselves. And I agree with him. I think, but as Jen rightly put it, a lot of women are afraid to. You think about some of the swimmers on the Penn team that had to accept Leah Thomas as a teammate and accept him in their locker room. And they were told, if you fight back, if you say anything publicly, you're never going to get a job. You're not going to get a recommendation. You're going to bring controversy to the pro. That's just a fear tactic, and that needs to be countered. And so these women need to be emboldened and need to be encouraged. And I'm so appreciative of Jen for starting this.
You're both friends with Riley Gaines. It does seem like it's getting less and less lonely around you. The New York Times recently has started doing reporting that is really challenging orthodoxies. It helped spread about transgender medicine and biology and all of these very, very important issues. So I want to ask both of you, as you interact with former acquaintances or colleagues in the industry, and I'm just going to go out on a limb and say I know that happens, that there are people who whisper to both of you and are afraid to say things publicly. Do you sense that people are waking up and that they will increasingly be emboldened to push us back to what was a very normal and appropriate status quo of respecting biological distinctions? Where do you guys see this going, and what do you hear from people in the industry? Whoever wants to answer that one first.
I do hear privately from female athletes, former athletes, some much younger than me, not quite so long out of their sport. Some Olympians, I hear from very high level former competitive athletes, females, who are like, yeah, I totally stand with you. I can't say it. It's too controversial right now. I hear from other corporate leaders that say the same thing. And I've lost patience a little bit for this. I mean, I don't want to pretend it's not hard. I don't want to tell them it's a walk in the park. It certainly isn't. Saying true but controversial things can radically alter your life. I'm not upset about where I am in my life, but it's not been easy by any means. So I don't want to lie about it, but I have lost patience. 70% of Americans agree with us because it is the common sense position, but it sure feels like it's like 1%. When you put yourself out there, because the fact is if even a fraction, even half of those people that agree with us were willing to say so publicly, this would be done.
Yeah.
It would be done. And so I find it quite frustrating. I do think at the end of the day that Michele is totally right, though. Sadly, sacrifice is necessary, and the currently competing athletes, and this is exactly what I saw when I was battling abuse in the sport of gymnastics, until the currently competing athletes stood up and said, no more. And don't think that wasn't a sacrifice, because they were dragged through the mud. It didn't stop. Well, it still hasn't stopped. USA Gymnastics is quite good at PRing it when it's still sort of going on. But at least they're pretending to try to fight it now, versus calling these women names. So I think we need all those people that are DMing me that have real authority. Maybe they're many medal-winning Olympians, but we also need the currently competing athletes. And I think we'll get there, but it's going to be we got to keep pushing.
It's a heavy lift, and yes, we're going to be the ones that have to do it. I hear from people quite often, and sometimes it's young athletes nieces, nephews, whatever, who are just shaking their head at this whole notion, like, what is going on? This is so unfair. We've seen Martina Navratilova come out and say, and she's quite liberal, by the way, but she has said on this issue, this is just wrong. You have J.K. Rowling, who's just been a champion on this issue, but currently competing athletes is absolutely essential. I keep saying to these young girls who get in the starting blocks at a track meet in high school, and there's a biological male next to them, get up and leave. You will get so much more support for that than you would for coming in second to this person. So get up and leave, and get your friends and your comrades around you, the people who are cooperating with you, the teammates, and say, we're not going to take this. I think I would stand up for my daughter in that way. I don't think she would want to be on a soccer team or a basketball team with a male. She understands this. She once said to me, Mom, I think I could kick field goals for the high school football team. And I said, yeah, that you probably could kick the field goal. But what if the snap was muffed and then you had all these huge 200-pound men running toward you? Then what? She goes, oh, yeah, never mind. So, They get it. They get it. But it is crucial that the athletes right now not wait until they get out of the sport to either come forward or not come forward, but to do it while they're in the sport.
Yeah, I thought maybe I could kick field goals when I was a kid, but that's a rude awakening when you sort of play it through.
Yes, exactly.
So the thing that worries me as we're kind of wrapping up here is that, actually it's about your story, Jen, really. The people who pushed you out at Levi's. I don't think that any type of vibe shift is just going to affect the decisions that some people at the tippy top of these leadership positions who are committed ideologues. They aren't all committed ideologues, and I have much less experience in this space than both of you, the highest echelons of corporate America, corporate media spaces. But I also really do worry that, the public opinion can be in one place. You can have Michele and Jen out there doing great, successful brands, successful podcasts, and these committed ideologues, because they have so much support in their own ideological spaces, they could keep smearing J.K. Rowling. They could keep smearing both of you, and they can double down. They can keep making sure that men compete in women's sports. And so, Jen, I'll start with you on this and go to you, Michele. What do you say to that? Why are you optimistic in the face of that, maybe?
I think more and more people are getting tired of the lies, whether it's around this issue and sort of insisting that we say that trans women are women, or some other issue. For me, what opened my eyes was COVID and the restrictions in particular to children during COVID. And now I just see the lies everywhere, and you can't really unsee it once you see them. And I think more and more people are seeing it. At the RNC, Amber Rose, which I know was a little bit controversial and some conservative folks didn't like, and I wouldn't consider myself a conservative, and I'm just here to say I think that had huge impact. For a woman to stand up there who comes from liberal circles and describe her, for lack of a better word, journey, it makes it okay to say, you know what, I learned something and I changed my mind and I've been fed lies and I don't believe them anymore. To hear her story about going against what everyone in her social circle had said, it's really meaningful. And I think conservatives, if you followed it online, which I do too much, dismiss how important that is. And I think for this movement in particular, we need to move away from it being coded as entirely a conservative political issue, because it's not. And both of the women that Michele cited, Martina Navratilova is still a committed Democrat, but she believes in reality on this issue. And J.K. Rowling, I don't would consider herself a conservative either, and I don't. And so, we need people like Amber Rose. We need people like Martina. We need more of them. We need young ones. And of course, I love and respect and value Riley's voice, and we need her to bring more young women into the fold. But this should not be politically coded in any way. This is biology. This is reality.
Well, Michele,
you have to push to. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, the people in the C-suites, places like Comcast, places like ABC, Disney. Will they ever buckle?
I think ever, yes. And I agree with Jen. It's going to be a slog. But I agree with her. Like bankruptcy, it happens slowly and then all at once. I think that what we're seeing in a lot of states is they are codifying Title IX to take out these allowances for transgenders to be in these other spaces. So it needs to get codified in more states. And then, yes, the bravery needs to happen. And that's why I'm so thrilled about Jen's project, because we can encourage it, we can reward it, and we can amplify it, and we can honor it and respect it and show these young women that, yeah, you're surrounded by some real badass women up here, that we've done it too, but we want to show you that you can do it too. Even if you're 17, 18 years old, you can do this. You can take a stand. And I do think, even though it does have to be, as Jen emphasized, it's got to be people competing now. It's going to take a lot of different stakeholders, more dads, more people in the C-suites, more coaches, whether they're male or female. But you have seen some of that has gone punished. I think Jen said something that is absolutely spot on. And that is that we're noticing we're being lied to about a lot of stuff, not just this one. And whoa, so once it hits your radar, like if it's something that matters to you, and you start to go through that, hold on a second, and you start to ask questions, you start to see it. It can't be unseen. It's just like the bell can't be unrung. And so I do think that this is not by any means over, but I do believe we'll get there.
Yeah, I remember talking to Riley. I was thinking of this as you guys were discussing different people who've gotten involved in the movement shortly after she had stood up against Lena Thomas. And I asked if she ever thought that would happen. And she was like, no, I never thought. I was just like not thinking about politics. And I feel like that resonates a lot with many of the people that you guys are working with. So Michele Tafoya of the Michele Tafoya podcast, Jen Sey, CEO of XXXY Athletics. Check out the XXXY Athletic Fund, and you can check out the line that they're both modeling right here. Looks great. Thank you both so much for coming on.
Thanks, Emily, for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're enjoying the content, please go ahead and click subscribe, or you can go to undercurrents.tv for the full experience and behind the scenes content. We also have a podcast version of the show, so if you'd like to listen on the go, search Undercurrents wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.